Finally, there's going to be some news around the Montreal Canadiens. We're Monday, May the 6th, and in 20 odd hours from now, there's going to be the draft lottery for the upcoming draft. Exciting stuff, Arpin. I'm looking forward to it. How about you?
Yeah, I am. What I love is, and we do it too at the Athletic. Everyone kind of does it. Is all these prep pieces for the draft lottery. Like, here's what could happen.
Yeah.
Yes, these are literally the things that could happen. The Canadiens could pick first, second, fifth, sixth, or seventh, basically. So it's there's I guess there's stuff to talk about with each possibility, but really it couldn't be more of a random thing. Well, no, it could be more if it wasn't weighted odds, but we know that the Canadiens have 8.5% chance at first, 8.6% chance at second, and then the bulk of their possibilities lie at 24.5 for fifth, 44% for sixth, and 14.2 for seventh. So there's also a 0.3% chance they pick third, which would require, I guess, two teams.
Yeah.
Anyhow, won't get into that, but it's definitely going to shape, the Canadiens' ability to win the draft lottery. One of the top two picks would definitely shape the way they approach the draft.
For sure.
There's no need to say it. Obviously Macklin Celebrini would change their plan immensely if they could pick him at number one. Ivan Demidov at number two. I think it's pretty safe to assume that if the Canadiens got that second pick, that's what they would use it for. But whether they pick fifth, sixth, or seventh, I don't know how much that really would change that much, unless the way the draft is shaping up changes drastically between now and the draft, which it could. There's always late movement. There's always sort of reevaluations, and you look at their two last top picks. David Reinbacher was a late riser, maybe not in their own eyes, but in the public view. Juraj Slafkovsky was a late riser, maybe not in their own eyes, but in the public view. And I think in Slafkovsky's case, even in their own eyes, because the World Championships, which are coming up, was a big event leading to Juraj Slafkovsky being that number one pick for them. But it's the way the draft looks and the way the Canadiens' priorities lie. 5, 6, 7 probably is not as monumental a difference for them, assuming that there are a good amount of defensemen who go in the top 5.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we think of Macklin Celebrini at number one and the 8.5% chance of it happening, it's not going to happen. But 8.5% chance, that's pretty much when Cole Caulfield would shoot a puck that would hit the net this year, he would score a goal 8.5% chance of the time.
Yeah.
If you want, because basically that's one out of 11, 1 in 11, 1 in 12 chance of things happening. So it's like guessing the correct outcome, like on a coin toss, 3 times in a row. That's the same. That's 8.5% chance of things happening.
All right.
You're more likely to draw a king out of a deck of 52 cards. It's more likely for the Canadiens to win the lotto, that lottery, than drawing a king out of a deck of 52 cards. So it's not impossible. Let's
no. They have the fifth best odds, So So let's see what happens. But Macklin Celebrini would drastically change things for this Canadiens team. We had a question. We have our mailbag coming up. We had a question on that in the mailbag. How would Macklin Celebrini change things?
Yeah.
and there's a, it just vastly changes everything. It would give them, the entire shape of their build would shift to building around this kid as opposed to kind of the group that they're building around now, which whoever they would pick at 5, 6, or 7 would become part of that group. Well,
Mm-hmm.
Celebrini would, yes, technically be part of that group, but he would be
In a
the
tier of his own.
standout. In a tier of his own, he would be the centerpiece of the Canadiens rebuild as opposed to like a collective rebuild. And I think we were talking about last week how the Canadiens have to look at models like Carolina, maybe Dallas, like these more sort of depth based models, teams that don't have that high end talent. Well, that would change, and you could argue that would change if they land at number 2 as well
Yeah.
with Demidov. It's he seems like that game breaking type of talent that the Canadiens don't have and that they would like. So we'll find out. Tuesday we'll find out. We'll see what happens. Ken Hughes is scheduled to speak after the lottery, no matter what happens. So I don't know what he's really going to say, other than if they win one of the top 2 picks. But it's there's I guess a not quite 1 in 6 chance that they win one of the top 2 picks, something like that.
Well,
So
yeah, 17% chance. That's pretty good. That's
yeah,
that's as they say in many articles I read. There's a non-zero chance that of it happening. I mean, decent.
it's very
17%
non-zero.
is yeah, 17% is decent.
Yeah, and
So
it's and I think it's worth mentioning like there is a drop off between Celebrini and Demidov, but it's Demidov would really kind of complete the group that the Canadiens already have quite
mhm.
nicely. As a winger, he's only a year away from being from being freed from his contract in Russia with St. Petersburg, and a high scoring dynamic winger is if you had to pick kind of one position where the Canadiens really have a glaring hole. Um, Assuming Doc, obviously, with everything, assuming Doc becomes what the Canadiens hope he becomes, it's probably that. It's not like they would reject a high impact center like Celebrini, obviously not, but Demidov would have not an equal impact, but still a pretty significant impact on this team's build if he were to be added to the mix. Uh, just because of I don't want to say can't miss nature, but he represents something that the Canadiens lack and like a lot.
Yeah, and also the gap between Demidov and Celebrini is difficult. I guess there's a part of it that's hard to measure because we have not seen Demidov in international competition. Even
Mm-hmm.
Mishkov last year, there was because of his participation in under 18 tournaments in the past. There was a way to see how he measured up compared to the Shane Wrights and the Connor Bedars and guys like that. But in the case of Demidov, he's been in isolation, so the projection is what you see in the Russian bubble, but there's no best on best points of comparison. So who
Mm.
knows? I think that comes into play to a certain extent, but I think there's no denying that Celebrini remains like the clear cut cream of the crop for this class. So we'll see. Maybe we have something intriguing to discuss on our next pods, depending on their lottery order, their
Mm-hmm.
ranking for the upcoming draft. But for the time being, we thought of discussing. I mean, we've seen in the first round of playoffs a lot of teams uh, deploying five defensemen instead of six in terms of general use. Some teams use six defensemen, and we brought up in the past on more than one occasion the fact that the Canadiens were banking on their hoist of young defensemen to drive that rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at the way the playoffs have been going so far, and the choices that are in front of the Canadiens, maybe as soon as next training camp when it comes to their defense core, how does that impact? What do you consider them to be in a good position? Um, for the future with that bank of young defensemen, and how should they use it based on maybe what we see in the playoffs, if that's all at all irrelevant.
Well, what struck me is watching the Stars and the Golden Knights play in Game 7. Nils Lundqvist, defenseman for the Dallas Stars, former first round pick of the New York Rangers, played 3 minutes and 9 seconds in that game. In those 3 minutes and 9 seconds, he managed to be on the ice for a relatively glaring defensive error that led to a very easy goal by Brett Howden. A tap-in goal, backdoor. Lundqvist's man lost him, and in the playoffs, that's all you need. Just that one glaring mistake, and that could have been disastrous in a game like that for the Stars, who have legitimate Stanley Cup aspirations. I mean, that is a solid team, and they wound up winning. But you look at their defense.
He's a Gorton Bob Ruff draft pick, by the way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so, yes, absolutely. So he's been in and out of the lineup in Dallas and sort of never really solidified his spot. But the fact that they felt in this ultimate game that he was going to be their number 6 defenseman is obviously less than ideal. They only felt comfortable, and I didn't actually check. I don't know if he played after the goal, but that's in playoff time. Having those defensemen who can play. No, he did not play a shift after that goal. So that goal was the end of his night. And that came, sort of somewhat late in the second period. So when you think of the Canadiens and you look on the other side, like Vegas, Vegas has kind of a 1-6, or I should say had at this point, a 1-6 that was pretty solid, that you could trust. I think the low end, you had someone like Zach Whitecloud, solid playoff style defenseman. Braden McNabb, I'm a big fan of his game in the playoffs, obviously. And then, Pietrangelo, Hanifin, and Theodore are a good trio to have. Then Alec Martinez, veteran, obviously. And so it strikes me that you can't, on defense, you can hide forwards that you don't necessarily trust, but who bring you a certain element. And so there's ways to get them on the ice, depending on matchups, depending on who their line mates are. There are ways to kind of cover up, but on defense, it's a lot more difficult. And so the Canadiens, the way their defense is lined up, strikes me that they should have 6 solid defensemen for the foreseeable future, depending on what they do this summer, depending on who they evaluate as being most likely to hit their ceiling and be that guy. But, you see a lot of people talk about like Jordan Harris and, Jaden Struble, maybe even Justin Barron, and look at a lot of the depth the Canadiens have on defense as being their third pairing guys. Well, in the playoffs, third pairing guys might only play 12, 14 minutes, but those are really important 12 or 14 minutes. You cannot, when the margins are so thin, look at that Game 7, Boston-Toronto, it's all it takes is one mistake and you're screwed. And so the reliability factor, and that's where I think really Jordan Harris took really big steps this year, Struble obviously, but it just seems like they have guys who are not going to be surefire top 4 guys, but they're going to have a wealth of options to pick from in terms of bottom pair guys that they can rely on in the playoffs.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Boston-Toronto game. I mean, I gave a lot of flack to the Maple Leafs for not going after a more solid top 4D and instead going for more.
Chris Tanev.
Man, would Chris Tanev look good in that uniform?
Chris Tanev was phenomenal in that game.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
For
For
Dallas.
Dallas, he's been
Yeah.
great. He's been great throughout the series. I mean, he's been dominant.
Hmm.
Um, so the Leafs went after more depth, more third pairing guys with Edmondson and
Labushkin.
Labushkin also. But I mean,
Yeah.
it's not when you look at that series, it's not Labushkin, it's not Simon Benoit that cost them the series. Benoit actually had a very good series for them,
So
but
did
those are
Edmondson, for
guys.
that matter.
Those are depth guys. So
Mm.
if you have someone who can take the bulk of the workload and play for your team 24, 25 minutes, well, to your point, if you have enough quality third pairing guys, that might be a good way to go at it. But then again, I mean, to come back to your first example with the Dallas Stars and Nils Lundqvist, the 5 other defensemen have been very solid for the Stars, and you're probably. I mean, if you have 5 very good D and you can do without a 6, that's okay. I mean, having 6 very good defensemen, that's even better. But
Mm.
not every team is the Carolina Hurricanes for that matter.
No,
So
but
can the Canadiens become that with what they've got?
in terms of a defense core, I think they can. They can come somewhat close to it. I remember, what was the year? 2015. I think that's the right year. I'm so bad with years. But anyhow, the year the Blackhawks beat the Lightning in the Stanley Cup final. I think that's 2015. They basically played the hell out of Duncan Keith, Brent Seabrook, and I think it was Johnny Oduya who got a lot of those minutes.
And Hjalmarsson too. I think that
And Chalmerson,
they
yeah.
played 4. They played 4 guys.
They played 4 guys, and every round you're like, how long can they do this?
Yeah.
And they did it all the way to the Stanley Cup. But that I think is a bit of an outlier. Like generally over the course of the war of attrition that you have to go through. I mean, look at Dallas. Dallas just goes through the 7-game war with Vegas, and their reward is Colorado.
Yeah.
If they get through that, then they get one of Edmonton or Vancouver, and then they have to go win the Stanley Cup. So consistently playing 5 defensemen the way that they have, or the way they did last night at least, and generally over the course of the series, risks catching up to you. I mean, ice time last night for the Stars, Miro Heiskanen 26-25. What a phenomenal hockey player he is. It's just incredible to watch. Chris Tanev 24-19. Thomas Harley has really emerged this year, 22-15, as a great partner for Heiskanen, and Esa Lindell, who was great last night and really at 22-19, and then Ryan Suter at 19-54, who was kind of the scapegoat last year for the Stars, and a lot of fans wanted to see him gone, providing that sort of Edmondson-like support on the back end, sort of a tough, rugged defenseman. So it's, if you look at, like, maybe the Canadiens could get there one day, maybe the Canadiens could get to the Carolina Hurricanes model, but it just strikes me that we're reaching a point at this training camp where we're going to start to see some of that take shape. Because when you get to training camp this year in September, you will have Michael Matheson, 1, perhaps David Savard if he's not moved this summer, but maybe let's say he's there. 2,
Yeah.
Harris, Lane Hudson, Gooley, Jacky, Kovacevic. That's 7. You add Mailloux to that mix. That's 8. You add Justin Barron to that mix, that's 9. You add Struble to that mix, that's 10. You add Reinbacher to that mix, that's 11. And then you add Adam Engstrom, who was just signed to his entry-level contract, that makes 12. And that's not even counting William Trudeau. I think everyone expects Matthias Norlinder to go back to Europe at some point here. His contract's up and doesn't seem like he's in the organization's plans, largely because of this dozen kind of legitimate defensemen I just named who will be arriving at training camp next season, trying to win a job. And, how do you see that playing out? I mean, we've talked about it. I mentioned the quote, Mike Matheson, who didn't even let me finish my question and said it's going to be wild. It is going to be wild. That's a lot of talent. That's a lot of young talent showing up at camp, thinking that they have and justifiably thinking they have a legitimate shot at making the Canadiens to varying degrees.
Well, I think it can they can go one of two ways. Either they say they're going to continue to grow together, that young decor, or we're going to delay as much as possible and not, burn any step when it comes to Mailloux, Reinbacher, and even Hutson. And if we have the chance to do that, leave them in Laval for longer. So it's going to go one of two ways. But all those young defensemen, and you mentioned the possibility also of moving Savard over the course of the summer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just concerned with the lack of experience and the time that it might take for these guys to come to maturity as a group.
Mm-hmm.
It might take, before that they're the quality of the Carolina Hurricanes, for example, and they have their own versions of Brady Shea and they have their own versions of Jacob Slavin and Brett Pesce and whatnot. It'll be 3 years, if not more, but let's say 3 years. So either you go that way and you say, you know what, we're comfortable with the growing pains that go with it,
Mm-hmm.
or you say, okay, hold on, we might hold on to Savard, or if we choose to move him, we're going to sign another vet, but we're going to make sure that this group does not falter because of his lack of experience. And I guess that the potential is there. The potential, I don't necessarily see high end on a lot of those kids, but you have a chance because there's so many of them. You're sure to hit on enough of them to provide you over time that sort of reliable top six that you can deploy comfortably in the playoffs and say, you know what, we don't have to shelter one guy and play only five. I think they'll have that sort of depth. That's interesting. But to me, the concern is how long are you willing to wait for the whole group to come together? When Kent Hughes gave me that example about, for example, we wouldn't want to sign a right shot D long term if it meant it would block one of a young defenseman, which means it went exactly against the idea that I had brought up to you in a previous episode, that signing a guy like Brett Pesce, for example, would enable you to take your time with both Reinbacher and Mailloux on the right side. But the way that the Canadiens seem to view it is that, well, if we sign a veteran and he's going to cost us a lot of money, well, he might block the way to those guys like Reinbacher and Mailloux. But the flip side to that is, if you don't do that, you might be in a position where you have to hand them more prominent roles than they might be ready for right from the get-go. And I'm not sure if you want to bring quality. You don't bring stopgaps defensemen for a year or two if those guys are really quality guys. You might bring veterans that are third pairing guys for a year or two, sure. But if in the meantime you want to bring guys that provide a good example, that raise the bar on your defense group and that are viable option for long term, well, if a guy like Pesce makes it so that, it takes for the next 3 years, Mailloux is not your top pairing guy or top four guy, and he's on the third pairing, well, big deal. And the day that both Reinbacher and Mailloux prove that they're better than an aging Pesce, and all of a sudden Pesce's price tag becomes a bit of a bigger weight on the salary cap, well, it's going to be a good problem for the Canadiens to have, because it means that both of those young defensemen have fulfilled their promises. So to me, it as much as we look at this defense core and we say, wow, they have so many of them, the fact that all of them are so young, to me, it remains a concern.
Yeah. I agree with that. Well, we actually, okay. So we had an email for the mailbag that really hits on this and actually talks about Carolina specifically. It came from Josh. Pretty long email. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically he asked, in Carolina's case, like Slavin and Pesci, I really have to get over seeing Joe Pesci's face whenever we refer to Pesci. But anyhow,
Yes.
yeah. So
Leo gets,
or just am I a clown to you? That's all I think every time you said the word Pesci. That's all I thought of. But anyhow,
funny how. Okay.
Yeah. Anyhow, sorry. I'll go on. Yeah. But you really looked at Carolina, and Carolina did to some extent throw Slavin and Pesci in and gave them prominent roles relatively early, around 21 years of age, and let them grow into those roles and started sort of augmenting around them. But weren't afraid to do that. And I think thanks for the question, by the way, Josh. It's actually, we were going to talk about this today, and it really fit really well. So I hope this is a sufficient answer for your question. But basically, the question was, am I wrong to think the Habs blue line is a particularly interesting / unique situation that might benefit from a bespoke exit path? Essentially saying, since rookies often have trouble on defense, like, can the Canadiens afford to throw these guys to the wolves and let them figure it out? And I know that the Canadiens have some reluctance to doing that, but I do think that they had reluctance to doing that last season. Mm-hmm. And watching how Gouli reacted, watching how Jacky reacted, watching how Harris reacted, and the growth that they had, I think maybe opened the Canadiens' eyes to the possibility that maybe if they do this together as a collective group, and there's so many of them that if you swap them in and out from Laval to Montreal and allow guys to take a breath, go to Laval for a bit, come back and manage it that way, that this could be a viable way for them to have this group take significant steps this season while allowing the Canadiens to remain somewhat competitive. And I don't think, I feel like there's some validity to that. I feel like there's, the Canadiens don't have massive consequences this season if these rookies struggle. As I just mentioned, if one of them hits a slump, anyone who's still waiver eligible, which is a bunch of them. I mean, right now, as it stands, Barron will no longer be waiver eligible, but, you have Mailloux, Struble, or waiver exempt, I should say. Sorry. Barron's going to lose his waiver exemption, but you'll have Reinbacher, Mailloux, Struble, Engstrom as waiver exempt guys, plus Jacky for some of the season, Gouli, and Hutson. Now, I don't anticipate Gouli ever going to Laval. It would shock me, but
no.
But yeah, but of the other guys, you have enough of a group there, especially if they keep Savard. But even if they don't, you have enough of a group there. Harris is no longer waiver exempt, by the way, just in case you were wondering. And obviously, there's Kovacevic, who's still around, who's not waiver exempt. So, which is how the Canadiens got him, because he's not waiver exempt. So, there's enough of a group there where the Canadiens can say, let's just go with this. Let's just go with it and see as many of these guys as we can without necessarily having a dip in performance collectively as a team.
Yeah, but when you do that, if you open the door to this idea of a revolving door, which is fine, I'm not sure to which extent it fits with the idea of becoming a playoff team next season. I think that it suggests to me that you're still in the trial and error mode, the experiment mode, the development phase of your rebuild, and that it's only once you've identified your guys that you're going with, that you've determined their responsibilities and growing them in those roles, that you can have the ambition of say, okay, well, the picture is now clear, and we'll need this kid to do this and that if he wants to take the place of one of our 6 guys now. But as long as we'll give him a taste and we'll take him down, etc. And to me, it's still a very premature phase. Not premature, but it sounds as though it doesn't sound like a playoff team to me.
Well, okay. Well, again, and this is kind of the premise of Josh's email, but when you look at Carolina, so Carolina in 2018-19 made the playoffs after missing for several years.
Yeah.
Like almost 10 years in a row. Mm-hmm. They made the playoffs with a defense that had Noah Hannafin at age 20. They had Justin Falk, who was 25, kind of the veteran presence there. And Josh made the comparison between Falk and Mike Matheson, and I think it kind of has some credence. Jacob Slavin was 23. Pesce was 22. They had TVR, Trevor Van Riemsdyk, who was 26. And then they had Hayden Fleury, who played 67 games for that team, who was 21. So they did that. And they had a very young team in front, too. Like Aho was 20. Teravainen was 22. They had Skinner still back then. He was 25. Elias Lindholm was 22. So they had a young team, and they just kind of decided to go with it. And it's not inconceivable that would work. It's to at least get to the playoffs, and to think that that's their the value for those kids in going through that. Now, the argument could be made that since then, the Carolina Hurricanes still have not won the Stanley Cup. They've made the conference finals quite regularly, but have not won the Stanley Cup. So there's an argument to be made there that maybe that wasn't the right thing, but I don't think you would look at any of those defensemen and say that hindered their development.
No.
I think that's where it gets interesting in the sense that, maybe the benefits of that are worth exploring. I mean, you look at Miro Heiskanen, and I don't want to make this comparison, but I did have a pro scout say that when they watch Ryan Backer play, it reminds them of the qualities that Miro Heiskanen has. I don't think he's quite at the same level as him, but the quick decision making, the sort of the assertive defensive play, the spurts of physicality that come out of Heiskanen, and there's similarities that were drawn. And so Heiskanen, like Ryan Backer, went back for a year in Finland after being drafted, and then stepped right in, played 82 games as a rookie, and hasn't really looked back since. And so there's something to be said for, his rookie year, the Stars made the playoffs with him playing a really prominent role. So, sometimes I think that there's a lot of reluctance when it comes to defensemen because of generally how much longer it takes for them to develop. But I think that the willingness that teams have to allow a forward to just figure it out because they're so talented. I think it would be interesting. It would be an interesting experiment, I think, to see that happen on defense at such a wide scale. If the Canadiens decide to go this way,
that's what they've already been doing. It's just continuing that way by incorporating more of those young players.
Well, you're adding a lot more elements. That's what's and you're adding the highest end element.
Yeah.
The two highest end elements that you have, three really, if you consider Mailloux, Reinbacher, and Hutson as being their three highest ceiling defensemen, you're infusing an already young group with that. And that's interesting to me. I find that interesting because I think like Gouli, Jacky, to some extent Barron, Harris, these are guys that have experience. They're still young, but they have experience. And if they allow the Canadiens to kind of accelerate these guys' transition into the NHL, I don't see why not. I don't see why not. I took a 5-year sample of defensemen last week all the first round picks from 2010 to 2014, and it's all over the map. There's all sorts of defensemen who integrated the NHL right away and was fine. And there's some who did and they weren't fine. And there's some who took longer. Josh Morrissey hit his ceiling at age 27, for instance. But Cam Fowler played it as an 18-year-old and was outstanding. But generally you look at it, it's 23 to 25 is the window for defensemen to really hit it. And Harris is there. Gooley's on the cusp of it. Jackai's entering that window. They have guys who are age-wise at least, now maybe not from a games played standpoint, but from age-wise, they're not that far from there. Barron's there, Strubal's 22. So I don't know. I feel like, yes, you have to be careful with it, but I think the Canadiens are in a sort of unique position here with just sheer volume of these guys that they have, that they can manage it and draw the best kind of benefits out of it by doing something that's totally unconventional.
Well, don't get me wrong; it's a nice problem to have. It's great that they have that bank of young defensemen, but you see, it's just I look at the way things have gone the past 2 seasons with deploying one of the youngest D-core in the league. Last year, for sure, it was. It might have been this season too, and the overall, I mean, the Canadiens have made some steps in organizing themselves defensively, but there are some growing pains still for the whole team and for the D-core, especially to figure out things in their own end, figure out things on the PK. On that list of young defensemen, for example, are there prominent potential effective penalty killers apart from Caden Gooley? I hope there is. I suppose that, could Harris be one? Reinbacher, I guess one day will be one. Yeah. But it's my point is that when you have a young D-core and the progress defensively and facing the rigors of tough opposition makes it so that the gains you make as a team from one year to the next, although they're there, I'm not sure if by adding even more young defensemen, you are able to make sufficient games that will fit the ambitions that this team has. Because if they want to be a playoff team next year, they're going to need to straighten out themselves defensively a great deal. I mentioned penalty kill. It's going to have to be miles and miles better than what it was this year. I understand that it's not just a matter of defensemen. The forwards are involved in there too.
The coaches are as well.
I'm sorry?
The coaches are as well.
The coaches are as well.
Yes.
Yeah, there's that portion of the puzzle too. But do you expect any changes there? Because I don't.
I don't. I would consider it if I were the Canadiens, but I don't expect any changes there. It's the power play and the penalty kill. Look, I mean, you talk about looking at the playoffs right now, and it's striking the extent to which, especially in the first round, we always assume that special teams kind of get cleaned out in the wash in the playoffs, and it's really 5-on-5 play that drives it. Basically, the 8 best special teams made it through in the first round.
Yep.
The 8 teams that won the special teams battle in their rounds, in their series, won their series. It's easy to point at the Leafs power play, for instance, to say, and the Bruins power play to say that was the difference in that series, ultimately. So, when Ken Hughes was kind of strongly seemed to suggest at his end of season press conference that they don't see a need to make a change in the coaching staff. If they don't bring in new coaches, they need to do something where the coaching of the special teams improves drastically. It's I'll give the penalty kill a bit of a pass because they were clearly integrating a new system, a completely different formation, kind kind of following an NHL trend in a way, and it took them a long time to nail that down. And they made adjustments. They got killed on a lot of low backdoor plays early on because they only had one guy at the back of the diamond. Eventually, they dropped that back forward down. If the puck was, the weak side forward came down to take care of that. They made some adjustments as you went along, but the whole thing needs to be tighter. The power play showed signs of life at certain points, and Marty was just effusive in the praise and how proud he was that the power play looked great. And as soon as he said that, the power play just went completely to shit. And and it wasn't even being all that effective. Like, it's one thing if you don't get the results, like if you're not getting the goals, but their entries all of a sudden became a lot more difficult. Their high danger shots were not accumulating the numbers necessary to produce goals off of them. So, but to draw it back to the young defense, in that sense, I think that they would have a very valuable group on defense. Like, listen, if Lane Hutson makes the team, probably start on power play 2 and would give power play 2 some teeth. Obviously, if Doc's healthy, maybe Newhook shifts to power play 2, and you have just a few other elements that you can add to make power play 2 a viable NHL level power play as opposed to what it was this year. That gives you some options. If power play 1's not going, then maybe you throw power play 2 out there. Maybe you double shift Suzuki in that situation or what have you. And from the penalty kill standpoint, like, to me, this really comes the most interesting person to me out of this whole group in training camp next year will be Ryan Bacher, because I think the Canadiens see him, rightly or wrongly, honestly, but I tend to somewhat agree with them that while he is not flashy, he will be a foundational piece on defense just because of his ability to play a physical brand of hockey, and he doesn't shy away from it, and he's extremely competitive, and he has excellent defensive instincts. So, like, getting him incorporated into the mix on the penalty kill, I think would benefit him at the NHL level. And so these are all the calculations that have to be made when talking about which young defense you're going to play at the NHL level. And I don't think it's mutually exclusive from saying that you want to compete for a playoff spot, because while they want to compete for a playoff spot, I still don't think that's the ultimate priority of the organization. Yes, they want to play competitive games, but if they miss the playoffs by a little bit and all these guys have taken steps, then I think in the grand scheme of things, they'll see the season as a win. Yeah. But they just don't want to be out of it by the trade deadline. Like, that's really what they're saying, is that we don't want our season to end in February where we're playing meaningless games and we know we're out and we have to sell off more pieces at the deadline and what have you. I think they'd like to, in an ideal world, they'd like to at least have a debate at the trade deadline as to what do we do? Are we maybe not buying, but do we necessarily have to sell? If David Savard is still on the team and they hit the trade deadline and they're 2 points out of a playoff spot, and he's had an influence on all these young guys who are playing on the team, do you say, okay, let's just keep him and let him walk? Or do we need another second-round draft pick? Like, I don't think the Canadiens are in a phase where they need that second-round draft pick, and I don't think they see it as a case where they absolutely have to keep accumulating draft picks. Like, they have, they're past that stage. And so that's what's so fascinating to me about this whole debate, and what they're going to have to figure out in training camp is, I think what you said is true. You don't want to throw these guys to the wolves and watch them fail and have their confidence shattered and all the negatives that come with it. But it's interesting to at least consider the positives of it. Let's say they don't fail. Let's say they thrive. Let's say they're able to. And if they don't, we have the option to send them back to Laval, and it won't be considered a failure. And then we can bring them back up, have them play 15, 20 games the way Jack-I did last season, and then come back up and try it again.
Well, I think that also the management was pretty clear that everything will be made for the long-term good of the team. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that making the playoffs is an end-all objective for next season. It shouldn't be. And they do not. And I'm totally comfortable with this if the expectations are set at the right place. Because a description like, if they're just still somewhat in it at the trade deadline, that's good enough for me if there's real growth.
Well, I think that's what. But is that not what they presented the expectations as? I mean, yes, they talked about wanting to make the playoffs, but the word that kept coming up over and over again is in the mix.
Yeah.
They want to be in the mix. So anything like what Detroit did or what Philly did, or even the Islanders or Washington or all these teams that are kind of, especially Philly, I think. Like, you look at Philly, like Philly was in an awkward situation. They know that their rebuild is not anywhere close to being completed. They found themselves in that position. They had this prime asset in Sean Walker that multiple teams in the league were looking for, and they moved him. And they tried to offset it by adding Eric Johnson to kind of backfill it, if you will. But they made the right decision, and they kind of knew. And the young players on that team, even though they couldn't feel it while it was happening, I personally have thought about it, and I feel like they will benefit from that whole experience of failing, essentially, when the stakes got higher. That feeling of being so close and not coming through will help them avoid that feeling again to some extent, And so I think that's what Montreal can't come out and say that, and they would love to make the playoffs, but they want their players to experience that feeling, good or bad.
Well, we'll have a good idea of their intentions when we see who starts next season in Montreal. So even though it's going to be an exercise that I'm sure we're going to do more than once, let's just have a little fun and guess who's going to be their blue line. Who's going to be part of their blue line at the beginning of the season? Let's say you have 7 slots on defense. Who are those 7 guys, you think? If you had to,
I think they might go. I think they might go 8D.
Okay. Well, they won't have 3 goalies next year.
Exactly. They won't have 3 goalies. They won't have 3 goalies, so that'll avoid that. Yeah. I mean, so let's take, there's a given. Matheson, I think, will still be there. I think Savard's a real wild card. I'm going to leave him off because, no, you know what? I'm keeping Savard. Keeping Harris, keeping Gouli, obviously, and keeping Jack. So that's 5. So I have 3 defensemen left. I'm going to put Hutson on that opening night group. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put Reinbacher on that opening night group. And I'm going to put Struble on that opening night group, which would leave Mailloux back in Laval, which would be a tough conversation to have. Now, the question here is Barron. If you don't take Barron on your group, which I haven't, you basically have to trade him, at which point you're not getting the value that you feel you should. So I think...
Well, the fact that he's not waiver exempt anymore puts them a little bit in the corner.
It does, 100%. And so I think that they will maybe look to trade Barron this offseason to avoid that situation coming to a head in training camp, and definitely avoid a situation where he's only on the roster because he can't get through waivers, much like he was to start last season, even though he could get through waivers. He was clearly the 7th defenseman when the season started, played himself into a bona fide top 6 role. Mm-hmm. But I just, I find it hard to see a scenario where he's kept over Reinbacher and he's kept over Mailloux. Now, this is where the Savard thing becomes so interesting, because if you trade Savard, then maybe you keep all 3 of those guys. But then, to your point, are you going to put out a right side of Reinbacher, Mailloux, and Barron and just go with that? So right now, I'm gonna lean towards keeping Savard, trading Barron, and so that's my 8, which I can summarize before you go. So I had Matheson, Savard, Harris, Hutson, Gooley, Jack. I didn't include Kovacevic in my 8, which I think he might be bumped.
Yeah.
And then Reinbacher and Struble. Is that 8? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Wow. That's tough.
It's tough.
I think
it's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. And 8 defensemen. The other thing with 8 defensemen is, you want to have a maximum of those guys. To further your point of having plenty of those defensemen having the taste of the NHL and developing together as a group.
Mm-hmm.
But you can only dress 6 at a time. So you're sitting some of your best prospects.
Yeah.
Because night after night for roster decisions, I'm not sure if it's optimal. I would keep 7 rather than 8 for that reason. So,
okay, so who are your 7 then?
My 7 would be Matheson, Gooley, Jacky, Struble, Savard, Hutson, and Reinbacher.
No Harris?
So
you're trading Harris?
I think that Harris would be a scapegoat. Not a scapegoat, but a victim of the circumstances. Okay. Victim of the numbers. Yeah.
Interesting. So you'd have to trade Harris and Barron under that scenario.
Yeah, and Kovacevic. So the reason I see, you could keep Harris if you choose to move Savard.
Yeah.
So then, if you move Savard, that's Matheson, Gooley, Jacky, Struble, Harris, Reinbacher, and Hutson. That's a young blue line.
Oh, it is, but I mean, I think it's going to be a young blue line regardless. I mean, that's why I think the benefit of keeping Savard, but I do think they'll take calls on Savard this offseason. Like that seems quite clear to me. And so, but again, I see the benefit of just going all in on your young defense right now. Sure. And let's see how much growth they can get out of it. Let's see how they can play the back and forth with Laval and Montreal. But yeah, so I agree. I think your 7 or my 8. I mean, it looks like interesting that neither of us had Mailloux in the group. Be a tough sell. Kid was an all-star in the AHL as a rookie. Showed a lot of promise. Really looks like a kid who's ready to make the jump to the NHL. That'd be a tough conversation to have.
Somebody on the team said he's our most ready defenseman. So basically, that means probably more ready than Reinbacher or Hutson.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, it's you have to find a spot for him. So
neither of us did.
No, I know, and maybe it's just the fact that I see. I those 2 games from Hutson at the end made me think that he doesn't necessarily need to go to the AHL, and that I could find a spot for him on this team right now. But then again, if he's given like not necessarily a specialized role, but let's say you talk about second power play, well, Mailloux would be coveting a similar thing, and I think that the Canadiens might be one of those teams that revert back to 3 forwards, 2 defensemen before long.
Yeah, it's possible. Reason. Well, I mean, yeah, and you could consider Hutson a quasi forward in that situation. So,
yeah, sure. Or he hates being called a rover, but some people will label him like that. It's going to be a puzzle because at some point by mid next year, Mailloux is going to be ready to play in the NHL. I'm pretty sure.
I think he's ready right now. That's the problem. He's probably ready right now. So and the thing is that there's only so many guys you could trade. There's only so many trades you can execute in one off season, and it'd be fair. I think on Harris, they probably have enough information right now to know more or less what he is. But on a lot of these guys, Struble, they got basically half a season, a little bit more, 2/3 of a season. Um, it's barren. It's tough. It's gonna be tough. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes, but it is going to be wild. I think that exercise kind of shows that building this defense group or determining what the defense group will be is a puzzle with all sorts of pieces that all look the same. Like it's basically a puzzle. Like when you get like 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle and 2/3 of it are the sky, like that's what this looks like to me, is figuring out these puzzle pieces that are all blue. And you just gotta get them together. So it's gonna be interesting. Okay, let's go to the mailbag. We're almost an hour into the episode, all of a sudden. But let's go to the mailbag right now. We do a mailbag every Monday, you know.
Let's go to the mailbag. Let's go to the mailbag.
Mailbag.
You know, they reach out and they write to
All
us.
right. So thank you, everybody, for sending us your questions. A lot of them this week again. That's fun. I love it. So bring it on. Okay, let's start. I'll go with let's see. Oh yeah, okay, a fun one here. Stuart Wiseman asks us, with a lot of draft news upcoming, there's one question I've always wondered: who is NHL Central Scouting and what is their purpose? With every team having their own scouts and lists, it always seems strange to me that the NHL employs a full department to scouts for seemingly no one. Are they made up of scouts who can't get hired by NHL teams? Most of them, yes. That's to answer your question, Stuart. Yes. The head of Central Scouting is the former head scout of the Atlanta Thrashers. Mm-hmm. So there's a group of guys that have made a career of working for Central Scouting. Others have been let go by their teams and have joined Central Scouting. But the idea is to offer a service that can be given to the various teams, but also just to make sure that teams don't have necessarily a blind spot. So let's say, I remember Trevor Timmons jokingly used to say, I take their list and I flip it upside down because he did not agree at all with their own rankings. But it's just an idea of saying, is there someone that for some reason we've been sleeping on or that has not been on our radar? And Central Scouting's there just to remind you that, that guy in Lithuania in second division or whatever, he's worth giving a look. So I think that there's that aspect. You could discuss their use or to which extent teams revert to what they have to say, but I think that it gives a benchmark to the whole league and to those prospects too, and see where they stand. So it's I think that their overall relevance is sometimes put in question by teams.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that the primary purpose of NHL Central Scouting, and I've had numerous NHL amateur scouts mention this, is that the main purpose that they provide is their initial ranking, is their initial players to watch list, which they put out very early in the draft cycle. A lot of teams already have an idea. Well, actually, I should say every team already has an idea of what next year's draft list would look like, or who the players are that are of interest for the following year. What that initial players to watch list does is it just expands that window. Like NHL scouts always focus on the guys that are available in that year's draft. Yes, they will watch players that are eligible in the future years, but their focus and their emphasis is always on the guys that they might be drafted that year. And so what the players to watch list does is it gives them the foundation of their scouting schedule, like who are the guys that we need to go see right off the bat? Who are the guys we need to go check video on? Who are the guys? So, and not at the top, obviously, but the guys who are projected to be third, fourth, fifth round picks that maybe you haven't really paid attention to. That list, that initial list, provides that framework. From that point, there's not a whole lot. I don't think there's much use for the NHL teams by what NHL Central Scouting does. It is largely, I think, the main benefit is public consumption. And I've always thought about doing this, and I haven't done it just because I don't think there's much value to it. But I've always wanted to go through the final NHL Central Scouting lists and compare them to the draft. I think some people have done. I think your colleague at Radio Canada, Martin Leclerc, did that one year, if I'm not mistaken. And it comes nowhere close to how the actual draft plays out year after year. You see.
No, but I remember someone doing the exercise of taking that list and applying to their own team and say that taking Central Scouting's list might have over time brought better results than what the team they were covering did.
Right.
So,
but I think
it's one list. It's one list among many. Teams themselves build their own list, and they would took public lists that from elite prospects or the Athletic or any other place. They might be snubbed by the team saying, we don't have that list at all. But even if you were to take the list from another team and give that to the head scout of another team, he would look at that list and, it's nowhere close to mine. So there's lists are so different from one team to another.
Yeah. All right. Good question, Stuart. So I wanted to actually just do kind of a category of questions because we had several on both Twitter and on email. We had several people asking about, Rémi Roy, Didier, Xavier, just to name a few. Let's see, there were others. If I can't find the other ones, anyhow. But basically, Andrew Robinson was another one. Basically talking about the possibility for the Canadiens to acquire John Tavares, who's entering the final year of his contract with the Toronto Maple Leafs, or Pierre-Luc Dubois, who within a year has completely fallen out of favor in Los Angeles. So these are two separate cases. I think if there's a way for the Canadiens to get creative, and if the Leafs were willing to eat some money, the Tavares thing is not out of the question because it would fit the Canadiens' finances well. You would add Tavares to the list of people whose contracts are expiring after the 24-25 season. So it would make sense in that regard, especially if they're able to, if that comes with sweeteners, or it allows them to shed a contract that they'd rather not have. I think someone mentioned Josh Anderson as a possibility. I could see something happening where the Canadiens benefit from taking on John Tavares' contract and freeing the Leafs from that cap responsibility. Pierre-Luc Dubois is a completely different can of worms that I don't think the Canadiens would touch with a 10-foot pole, no matter what the Los Angeles Kings do, no matter how many sweeteners they offer. The entirety of that contract is still on the books, except for 1 year. And to put it mildly, I would say that the entire process of that whole Pierre-Luc Dubois trade debacle just left a sour taste in the Canadiens. But they didn't want any part of that. They didn't see him as a vital piece of their build. They were kind of railroaded into it by Dubois' camp being so public in his desire to play in Montreal, the public pressure they felt to make a deal happen there. If it were up to them, and I wrote this at the time, this is not Monday morning quarterbacking. I wrote this when this was all happening, that if it were up to them, they would not be involved in that whatsoever. It would have been great. It would have been way better for them to just not be part of that whole situation. So now that they're not, there's no way in hell I see them climbing back into a situation that they didn't want to be a part of to begin with. So that contract is something, even at 50% retained, which the Kings would not do. It's bonkers for them. They would have what?
No,
12 years. It would be
might as well
12
buy him out.
years. Yeah, might as
Might
well
as
buy
well
him out.
buy him out
Yeah, that's it.
before he turns 25.
Well,
on
that's the
June
trick. That's
24th.
the tricky thing with Dubois, that he turns 26 on the same day that is the last possible day of the Stanley Cup final finishing. So he would have to be bought out before he turns 26, except the buyout window starts, I believe, 48 hours after the last Stanley Cup game. So if the Stanley Cup final were to end in 4 somehow, or 5 or whatever, maybe they would have a 48-hour window that would open, and then maybe they could get it in at the 1/3 buyout rate. But either way, whatever the Kings decide to do with Pierre-Luc Dubois, I would imagine the Canadiens will want nothing to do with it. And that ship has sailed. I think they're happy it sailed. They're relieved. They were never going to be able to provide a package that the Kings provided for the Jets. They were never going to want to sign the contract that Dubois signed with the Kings. They're not going to come back after the fact and jump back in there. So there were a lot of questions in that regard. I think there's some validity to the Tavares questions, even though I still think that would be unlikely. But there's
Of course, it would be
no
unlikely.
way.
Tavares has got a no movement clause. There's no way that he would accept a trade to Montreal. I don't think that there's any way that he accepts a trade.
He took a meeting with Montreal back in the day.
I think he wants to stay in Toronto. He's the captain of that team.
I get it, but it's not going to be a pleasant year. His last year in Toronto will not be pleasant. He will be a villain.
No.
If he invokes his no movement clause, he will be a villain in Toronto to an extent that he would not probably be comfortable with. If he is,
well,
it depends on how they play it. You know, I mean, it's really, it's not likely. I agree with you, but I'm just saying,
okay.
if John Tavares invokes his no movement clause and says, "I'm not leaving," which would be his right.
Yeah.
His last season in Toronto, this fairy tale story that he wrote for himself and the bed sheets and the pajamas and all that stuff would end in a way that would be so sour. It would just be, it would sour the whole thing. It would taint his whole return to Toronto. If it's not already tainted, you know, I mean, he is kind of seen as the guy that put the Maple Leafs in this cat mess through no fault of his own. None whatsoever. He did not ask Kyle Dubas and Brendan Shanahan to come fly to California and go to the CAA offices and be like, "Oh, let's make our pitch and whatever." It's not his. He didn't do that. They did that. But he will come out looking like the guy who's preventing the Leafs from turning a corner here if he were to do that. It's a terrible situation for him to be in, and a situation that, I mean, the only thing he did was have certain salary demands, but other teams were willing to meet him, including Montreal at the time. But yeah.
Well, I guess Marner would be also a villain to invoke his no trade clause, and
yeah,
if he wanted to be shopped. But I think in both of those cases, I think the spirit behind those questions was, can the Canadiens make the similar move like that they did with Sean Monahan, taking a contract from a team that was looking to shed some salary and get an interesting sweetener in return. So that's where I cannot picture the amount of sweeteners it would take for Dubois, and even for Tavares. It's almost like inconceivable for me that the Maple Leafs would put themselves in a situation where they say, okay, in order to reduce our salary, reduce our payroll, we're going to basically give away Tavares, hold on some salary, and give a nice, juicy draft pick or prospect to go along with it. And he's our captain. I just don't see that happening, certainly not in Montreal.
No, I agree. But the Dubois thing is a complete and utter non-starter. Like, that's the thing. Like, if the Maple Leafs approached the Canadiens and pitched something like that to them, they would not hang up the phone, is my point. Mm-hmm. If the Kings were to do that, he couldn't hang up fast enough. It would just be like, nope, not interested, click, bye. That would be the end of it. So that's the distinction I'm making between the two, is that I think they'd be willing to discuss one.
Right.
It's just a total non-starter with the other one.
Okay. McLeod or MC Loud says, could Ty Dellandrea be a buy low trade target? I considered mentioning him when we did our Doc Newhook type of trade because he fits in that mold. Finishing his entry level contract and all, and he's a former first round pick. Energetic player. I like him, but he's still a fringe player on a very, very good team, Stanley Cup contender as far as I'm concerned with the Dallas Stars. But I'm starting to wonder if there's a difference between, let's say, Alex Newhook, who was showing signs that in a different environment he could be more than he was able to be in Colorado, and Dellandrea, who has not really carved himself more than a fourth line spot so far. I'm getting hints a little bit of Tyson Jost here, with Dellandrea. Yeah. So he could be a gamble, but again, he's the question is a buy low trade target. Sure, if he's available, I wouldn't pay a ton for him, but he would be a good gamble. But generally, guys that because they have underperform are not likely to be asking for a long-term commitment or a huge pay raise. For a team like the Stars, maybe that they'll be willing to be patient with him and say, you know what, we'll give you a second contract, see how things go on, and in a couple of years we'll revisit. So maybe he'll stay put, and maybe he'll be part of a Stanley Cup champion team. Who knows? But if he becomes available in the market, sure, buy low, I'd be interested.
Yeah. The other one, I don't disagree with anything you said, although I think, I do think the ceiling in Dellandrea's case is debatable. We had another similar question on email from PM Labelle regarding Cole Perfetti, who I think is actually a far more interesting sort of candidate. He did not get into any games until the final one of the Jets series against the Avalanche. Played, I think, a minute and a half in the third period of Game 5. Rick Bowness announced his retirement today on this Monday as Jets coach, and it's pretty clear that the way Bowness viewed Perfetti and the way Kevin Cheveldayoff and his management group view Perfetti was quite different. And, you're not going to impose lineup decisions on your coach, especially a coach with the stature that Rick Bowness has. But a new coach entering the scene in Winnipeg would probably give a new life to Cole Perfetti and make it less likely that the Jets would feel the need to trade him. However, having said that, the Jets' top 9, a lot of it is locked in contract-wise. Now, Nick Ehlers might be on the trade block this offseason. I think he's actually likely to be on the trade block this offseason. My colleague Murat Atesh has reported that the Jets will be looking to trade him. Now, that could make some room for Perfetti in a more prominent role. But Velarde's signed. Scheifele's just starting his big extension now. Connor's got a few years left. There's not a lot of room for Cole Perfetti to sort of carve out a spot in Winnipeg. They're still in a competitive window. Dylan DeMello and Brendan Dillon are both unrestricted free agents, potentially. Some of the depth that we spent so long talking about on the Canadiens defense could be of interest to them. Their own first round pick could be of interest to them, some combination of that. So I think Cole Perfetti is an interesting case. He scored 19 goals in 71 games this year, top 10 pick, number 10 pick in the draft. I do think the bonus retirement changes the equation for Winnipeg, but they do have some decisions to make this offseason, and they have a lot of their forwards signed. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. Okay. On the email, Maxime Paiement, he refers to a column you wrote recently. He says, in your May 2nd column, you suggest that the Habs, and I quote, might be even tempted to spend the assets it would cost to move up in the draft to grab Demidov. Does the particular context of this draft, no consensus beyond the first pick, the huge quantity of talented defensemen in the top 10, each team having its preferred players, open the door for the Habs to climb from 5th to 2nd or from 6th to 3rd to select Demidov. And what would be the potential price? Is it the Jets pick and the Avalanche pick, the Jets pick and Logan Mailloux? In short, could this be finally the year when a team climbs into the top 3 via a transaction? I think that's a question that's going to be on a lot of people's mind if the Canadiens end up slotted either 5th or 6th for the.
Well, to me, it really depends on who's slotted second. If nothing changes, that should be the Chicago Blackhawks. But it's pretty rare that nothing changes. Like the Blackhawks, they only have, what do they have? 27.6% chance of picking first or second. So that leaves 72%, 72 and change that they don't. If Anaheim climbs to second, I know, the Canadiens had talks with Anaheim last year about moving up in the draft. They obviously didn't go anywhere. Pat Verbeek, as we've mentioned on this podcast, has clearly stated adding a right shot defenseman and a right shot forward is of interest to them. To me, if they have a chance, it seems to me that Demidov is such an opportunity here. I think there's a possibility, I guess, that some teams will have a different view of him than the consensus, but it doesn't strike me like there's as much of a chasm between sort of the public scouting services view of him and the internal view of him within the NHL as there was with Michkov. Because, everyone makes a big deal about the Canadiens passing on Michkov, but the Sharks passed on Michkov, the Coyotes passed on Michkov, the Ducks passed on Michkov. A lot of teams, if he's as good as everyone says he was, there's a lot of teams that passed on him. Every team that didn't pick Bedard between Chicago and Philly passed on the guy. So I don't know. I don't know if it's the same deal here, but Demidov is a left shot. If that means anything, I don't think it does. But he doesn't fit the criteria of what Verbeek wanted to add. But the answer to this question, I think, entirely depends on who has that second pick. Now, the Canadiens do have the currency to move up, but there's no recent modern precedent for what it costs to get from 5 or 6 to 2. It's really hard to determine how much that would cost, but I personally don't think the Jets pick would get it done. Jets pick's going to fall between 24 and 27.
Yeah.
So I don't think 5 or 6 plus 24, 25, or 26 or 27 is enough, but maybe it is. I don't know. It's really hard to say because we just don't see trades like this.
No, and that's going, let's say, from 5. If you go 5 to 2, 5 to 3, Jets pick might be enough if it's 24. It's 5 to 2. I don't see it.
Right.
Because the thing is, your reason to move to 2 would be because you've targeted Demidov. The rest of the defensemen are all over the place. The Anaheim could sit there and draft at 4th and draft Levshunov and have their right shot D, who would be a year away from being a contributor for them.
Yeah.
And
honestly, if Chicago has a chance to add Demidov, which I guess they're the odds-on favorite to do, which they are, I can't see them passing up that chance. No. You will have gotten someone who will ride shotgun with Bedard for years. It's going to be really difficult. I think it's going to take something wonky happening. Maybe if Columbus gets that pick, I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to, maybe I can't think of a team that would want to trade out of that pick. it's definitely not Buffalo, because if there's one team that has no fear of the Russia factor, it's Buffalo. You would need a team that fears the Russia factor to get it. It's clearly not
Yeah.
Philly,
It's clearly not Columbus.
and it's
They
clearly
have-
not Columbus. Yeah,
Columbus,
exactly. So,
they've got tons of Russians. So
but I think the one thing though that's evident is the Canes are going to try, but whether they can succeed, I think is up for debate. And I also think that if they fail, they're going to be fine with it. Like I think they'll get a forward they like at their spot.
well, that's the thing. Max suggests, he says, will it take the Jets pick plus Logan Mailloux? Does the difference between Demidov and say either one of Lindstrom, Ginla, Katin, whoever, is the gap so big that in order to do that, you're not only going to give the Jets pick, but you're going to give up Logan Mailloux to bridge that gap? It's a hefty price to pay.
Yes, I don't see that. Well, yeah, it would be a hefty price to pay. I think it would be the Jets pick or Logan Mailloux. I don't think it would be both.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the Jets pick is. Let's just say it though. I fully anticipate the Jets pick being traded in some way, shape, or form. Well, I would be very surprised if the Canadiens use the Jets pick to actually pick a player. So it might be used to move up from the Jets pick. Like maybe they'll package the Jets pick and the Colorado pick in the second round, or the Jets pick and the Flames pick next year to get into really high in the first round, or into the teens from that spot. But I would be very, very surprised if the Jets pick weren't traded in some way. And I would be mildly surprised if they didn't start trading picks from next year. Not their own. That would be a big gamble unless they put some protection on it. But
Right.
I think what we're going to see is the Canadiens are going to start to shift from, they're going to start to try to manage their prospect pool and not necessarily add to it as profusely as they have. So, like their extra picks next year, I think they're all in play this year, personally.
Well, they've got that mysterious Sean Monahan pick in the first round. They've got 2 second-round picks, so it's
three third-round picks and 2 fourth-round picks. So it's like they're going to start trading those picks. It's going to start happening, and so we'll see how they actually do it. But it's I think it might start this year. We'll see.
Okay, I got one here. Josh F. 1989 says, here are 6 pending UFAs after the 24-25 season. What do you expect to be done with each of them? Sign, trade, or expire? The UFAs are Dvorak, Armia, Evans, Pizzetta, Savard, and Kovacevic. Well, I would say that I expect all of those guys to be gone after next season, except maybe Jake Evans. But it will depend on a multitude of factors. First of all, well, the depth in the middle is not huge, so it depends. We just talked about first round pick. Do the Canadiens end up drafting a centerman? If they do, that might change the landscape. They'll have Owen Beck, who will arrive in Laval in the fall, but otherwise, there's not that many guys that are available in the pipeline. If they are committed to having Newhook mainly as a winger and not a centerman, then they might just need Evans. So if he's able to be not too greedy in his demands, and I don't think that he's in a position to be, I could see the Canadiens trying to re-sign him at roughly the same amount. But he's not on a good team. He's a fourth liner. He's a fourth line centerman. So you cannot give him a whole lot more than what you're already giving him. You could argue that it's already too much for a fourth line centerman. But there's a matter of need. There's a matter of also the role that he fills. He's the forward that plays the most in the NHL on the PK this year. They relied on him heavily. If he leaves, if Dvorak leaves at the end of the season, well, then you'll need guys to play on the PK too. So those are factors. I think that there's there's still a fit there. As to who would be just traded or whose contract would expire, depends where the team is going to be at the trade deadline. I think it's too early to say, well, would they trade Dvorak, Armia, Savard, or the other ones? I wouldn't venture to guess on that. But of that group, Evans seems to me like the only one who conceivably would get a next contract with Montreal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't see any. I mean, Evans obviously would depend on term, but if he were like basically, you'd like Evans as a bridge to back.
Yeah.
Or maybe even Jacky if they see Florian Jacky as a possibility as a fourth line center. The future fourth line of the Canadiens is also coming into view, and I don't feel it gets enough play. But Florian Jacky who showed up in Laval, you had Luke Tuck who showed up in Laval. Owen Beck will be in Laval, as you mentioned, in the fall. You have potential elements of a future fourth line also entering into the system. So yeah, if Evans agrees to serve as that bridge or provide a temporary insurance policy for someone like Beck, who I don't want to cap him as a fourth line center, but really seems to be someone who could turn into a pretty high end fourth line center. I would agree that he'd be the only one out of that group that would be re-signed. And, I think if the Canadiens are close to contention, then yes, guys like Armia and Dvorak would probably be kept in order to help them reach the playoffs if they're close. And if not, they could be traded at the deadline. Armia is the one guy that strikes me as perhaps being willing to take less to come back out of that whole group.
Yeah.
Okay. I think, just what he found last year in this environment, working with JF Bernard, working with Marty St. Louis, just the best version of himself that he's been looking for so long that maybe he'll tell himself, you know what, sometimes I've made a lot of money. If I want to keep playing in the NHL, maybe this is a good spot for me. And he could be part of that fourth line mix or third line mix or what have you, and take like kind of a short-term deal at less money, depending on how the season goes next year. Maybe he'd be that guy, but I don't think the Canadiens would be enticed if they had to give him a raise or give him a long-term deal. Then I think that's a non-starter.
The difference, I know that they're in a different situation, but there's a difference I see between Armia and, let's say, Anderson or Gallagher, is that Armia can have a specific role.
Yeah.
Like on a deployment on your team. But Anderson and Gallagher, over the course of their career, have demonstrated that they're not good on the power play.
Yeah.
So if they are pushed to your
Armia is better than them.
Yeah.
Armia is better than them on the power play. Yes.
yeah, for sure. He can help out as a bumper.
Mm-hmm.
He's definitely good on the PK. He's their best penalty killer, better than Evans, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got Anderson and Gallagher who are pushed to your bottom six at even strength, and they cannot help out on both of these your special teams, then there's contracts way even high. It's way even heavier on your salary cap. Whereas Armia, at a discount, fills a role that not necessarily a ton of guys would be able to jump in and do for you right away. So, but at the same time, if he's available at trade deadline, I could see a team making a run for him and offering something, but assuming that he continues on that trend and remains the version that we saw of him this year. But yeah, it remains. It still sounds unlikely for that same principle of saying we don't want to sign older players that will block the way to younger players coming in.
I think we could safely answer the question by saying that none of those guys will be brought back with a raise. That's a safe assumption. Okay, so yes, Evans might come back. Yes, I think maybe Armia might be willing to come back at a lower number. But I think for the rest of them, it's likely that this is a real opportunity for Montreal. Like that, the end of next season, opens a financial window because the year after that, Carey Price's contract expires. The year after that, the Gallagher and Anderson contracts expire. So it's really they've bridged this window to get to the end of next season where they can really take hold of their finances and really make it this administration's financial portrait. Like it's really the prior administration's residue has run everything the Canadiens have done financially since Gorton and Hughes took over. And so at the end of next season is really their first opportunity to have a stranglehold on their own finances. And it's the starting point of that. So it'd be hard to see them bringing guys back that limit their ability to fully take advantage of that. Because it would also coincide with a moment when, at some point the cap's going to go up higher than the 5% that it's been going up. It's going to go and once again be calculated based on hockey related revenue, which will also somewhat coincide with this time. So it's an opportunity that I think this administration is looking forward to a great deal.
All right. Do you want to pick a last one before we wrap it up?
Okay. Let's see. So we had one from Hugo, who asked, we've been discussing the possibility of the Canadiens adding another top six forward this summer, as it seems to be Hugo's modus operandi. However, I'm starting to think that the smarter move might be to acquire a bona fide top four defenseman. When looking at the teams that made the playoffs this year, actually, we kind of discussed this, so maybe we should choose something. Maybe we should choose something else. So let me go to the Twitter questions. Oh, yeah, it's not this. This comes from the Gargoyle on X. Is there a case to be made to use a high-value pick on Cole Hutson for the Habs?
Oh, the brother.
The brother who has set the USNTDP record for scoring by a defenseman. So something that Lane never managed to do. I mean, I would say, listen, if the Canadiens want to draft Cole Hutson, like enough teams saw what happened with Lane Hutson that this is not going to happen again with Cole Hutson. So if the Canadiens want to draft Cole Hutson, they would have to use that Jets pick. He's not going to get to the Avalanche pick at the end of the second round. So, and as I just mentioned, I would be very surprised if the Canadiens used that Jets pick to draft a player. So my initial answer would be no. They probably won't have the pick available to them to use to draft Cole Hutson. And really, I mean, I guess this is debatable, but how many Hudson style players, and this is a dangerous game to play, you never want to, but Lane Hutson looks like such a, I don't want to say can't miss, but very promising NHL defenseman for them. You can't really build an NHL defense with two of those guys. It's hard. It'll be hard.
Of that shape? No.
Of that shape. That's what I'm saying. Of that size, that profile. And plus, but yeah. So the answer is no on two regards. A, they have that player or similar player, and maybe Cole Hutson will be better than Lane Hutson, and maybe the Canadiens will regret not drafting him. But they're in that boat. And I don't think they'll have the pick, because I think that Jets pick is going to be used in some way to make some sort of trade. So on both accounts, I don't think they would.
No, I agree. And if that pick is still out there and they choose to draft a guy, I would see them going more like after Cole Baudouin or Andrew Basha or a guy like that. They're different players, obviously, but
they would draft a forward.
Not towards Cole Hutson. Yeah. Somebody else asked about Atos Koivu too, Saku's son.
Yeah,
he's not, but Saku's son is probably more of a third rounder. I would say
they could get him with that Avalanche pick in the second round if they wanted to, but they also have a number of third round picks. What do they have? Yeah. They have 2 third round picks. So yeah, I mean, also doesn't really, if we're being honest, and they did take Philip Mesher, so we shouldn't completely discount it, but just judging on everything that the Canadiens have said in terms of the types of forwards they want to add, Atos Koivu doesn't really fit that mix. Unless he has his dad's incredible gamer gene, which he might have.
Well, yeah, I spoke. I spoke to Mark Crawford. You spoke to him earlier this year, and I spoke to him about Vincent Rohr, who just who just won the championship with Zurich, and now he's off to the World Championships to represent Austria. And despite this smaller build, Rohr seems to be that type of guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mike Keane. He doubled down on the Mike Keane comparison with you, as he did with me in January. Exactly. So it's good that hasn't changed. That's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't mind that they draft a bunch of kids, but at some point they won't all play. So be ready to scratch some of them, move some of them. So there's just so many you can have on your team. All right, let's wrap it up. We'll be back next Monday. So in the meantime, enjoy the week, everybody. Thanks for holding on. My goodness, it's the off season, and we have our longest episodes. Yeah. I think that there's something wrong. We're slackers. We're a bunch of slackers.
What are you talking about? It's the longest episode in the hour. I don't even know what you're talking about. Okay, it's time to go because it's been an hour and a half. So thanks very much, and we'll talk to you next Monday.